So, welcome, dear friends. I'm John, Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitude Center Zoom session with our special guest today, Judith Valenti. You can find many other great upcoming Zooms at www.beatitudecenter.org. First, let me remind everyone who's live to please mute themselves and to write any questions you have for Judith in the chat link. I'm hoping Judith will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments, and we'll go at the end of the hour and a half and later send out the recording link. And after the session, I'll stay on for a few minutes for anybody if they'd like to continue to chat a little bit. So let's begin with a little prayer. And I just invite everybody to take a moment in silence and just take a deep breath and notice how you're feeling today, and to just, for a lack of better word, relax. Just relax and uh, and enter into the presence of the God of peace and love, who loves you infinitely, wildly, and personally, just as you are. And let's welcome the risen nonviolent Jesus here and ask for all the graces of Advent, that we might be people of preparation and peace and prayer like Thomas Merton. Beloved God, thank you for this day and for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us. Be with us now as we reflect with our friend Judith on the writings and wisdom of Thomas Merton, to help us that we might serve you better and more faithfully and follow the nonviolent Jesus ever more faithfully in these difficult times. Disarm us, heal us, inspire us, enlighten us, and strengthen us, that we might do what we can through your way of gospel nonviolence, to welcome your Christmas gift of peace on earth, to help end violence, war, racism, poverty, sexism, nuclear weapons, and environmental destruction, that we might welcome your reign of peace on earth and be who you created us to be. Beatitude peacemakers, your beloved sons and daughters. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So, dear friends, hello and welcome again. It's a great pleasure to introduce you and welcome my friend, our special guest, Judith Valenti, who is currently the president of the International Thomas Merton Society, which, if you don't know, check out merton.org, and you can go on to the /ITMS there. And I've invited her to speak on Thomas Merton's wisdom for these difficult times. Judith is a former staff writer for the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. She's a Benedictine oblate. She spent many years covering faith and values for Religion and Ethics News Weekly on national PBS TV. I wonder, Judith, if you covered me and Daniel Berrigan back in 1995. I think you did. She's the author of several books, including How to Live, an exploration of the rule of St. Benedict, The Art of Pausing, Meditations for the Overworked and Overwhelmed, and Atchison Blue, a memoir of her time spent with the Benedictine sisters of Atchison, Texas. She offers retreats on the themes of living a more contemplative life in the secular world. And you can visit her website at judithvalenti.com. She's a longtime visitor of Gethsemane and a longtime student of Thomas Merton. So she's just the perfect guest to have us in this Advent season. Judith, you're among friends here. So, dear friends, please join me and give a very rousing, warm welcome to Judith Valenti. You're very welcome here, Judith. I'll
Thank
sign
you.
off.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, John. It is really an honor to be with you today. And thank you for taking time out of such a busy season to join us this morning or this afternoon, depending on what time zone you are. And thank you, Father John, for the invitation. You have been a hero of mine for many, many years now. And 1995 was a little before my time with the show Religion and Ethics News Weekly. So sadly, that was not me who interviewed you on Dan Berrigan. So yeah, so thank you, though, for doing that interview. Some of you may have been to Gethsemane, and some of you may never have been to Gethsemane. So I thought, just sort of as a kind of an opening meditation, I would show a slideshow, a few slides of places in and within and around Gethsemane that were taken. All the photographs were taken by Brother Paul Quinnen, who was a novice under Thomas Merton. And many of you may know Brother Paul Quinnen if you've been to Gethsemane. But for me, there's really no place, no monastery like Gethsemane. I love the monastery where I'm a Benedictine oblate, but I truly, truly love Gethsemane. There's no place like it. The spirit of Merton is still there. And so if you haven't seen or been to Gethsemane, I offer this little slideshow for you as a way of getting into the discussion we're going to have. And it comes with music. The music starts out very softly. It's not your computer. The music then builds as we go on. So we'll see if the gods of technology are with us. I'm going to try to share my screen now. Okay, can you see the screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good, thank you. I'm gonna make it big. We want to go to the beginning. We want to go to the beginning. Come on, go back, go back. See what I mean, Father John? Whatever can go wrong will go wrong. Just a minute now. Bear with me. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, I think we want to start on that. We want to go here. And give me a thumbs up if you hear the music. Mm. I hope you enjoyed that little virtual visit to Gethsemane if you haven't been there. And if you've been there, perhaps you recognize many of those sites because this would have been the environment that Thomas Merton lived in, worked in, wrote about. And so it's always a joy for me to see all those sites again. I'm going to share the screen now as I begin my reflection on Merton's contemplative wisdom for times of crisis. Okay, can everybody see the screen? Okay, good, thank you. Well, I'm going to skip over a prayer I had since Father John said a beautiful prayer already, and we'll get going. The Chinese have a saying that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. May you live in interesting times. It is both a blessing and a curse. These days, we are certainly living in an uncertain time, if not a turbulent and dangerous time. Interesting? I guess you could say yes. Our planet, which you see here, looks so calm and so peaceful when viewed from outer space. Yet it seems that the whole world is experiencing a collective nervous breakdown. One can argue that our world is endlessly, in one way or another, in a state of crisis, always in a state of crisis. Still, we truly only know the crises we live through. These are the crises we own. And there's little doubt that we've been experiencing multiple converging crises affecting events around the world, our own national politics, and you could say the very soul of our nation. For one, there is the crisis of deep-seated and dangerous political division in our country. At the same time, we are confronting the ongoing racial reckoning and worldwide migration crisis, including at our own southern border. Add to that the continuing scourge of gun violence and a rise in hate crimes against ethnic minorities. For years now, the world has been in a constant state of conflict, including the terrible carnage in Gaza, Ukraine, Lebanon, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, and dozens of other places. Those most affected by the violence are the most fragile members of our human family. This is a child caught in the brutal conflict in Yemen, one that we hardly even hear about on the news. Yet a recent report about Yemen began with these words: Assad Hassan is the newest member of his family, and he may be the next to leave it. Most children in Yemen, like this child, like the children in Gaza, are starving to death. We also face unprecedented threats to our air, water, and soil due to pollution and climate change. And sadly, we are experiencing a spiritual crisis in which the very symbols of Christianity, meant to signify love, mercy, justice, peace, and nonviolence, have been usurped and used in acts of division, violence, and hate. Thomas Merton, too, lived in a turbulent time, a time of war, the Vietnam War, of terrible political division, if you remember the 60s, of race riots and social upheaval, but also in his time, a budding awareness of the damage we were doing to our air and water. Despite his monastic vocation, Merton chose to respond to the signs of his times. And to understand why, we must return to a morning in mid-March in 1958. The location was 4th and Walnut Streets in downtown Louisville. The sun shone high in a cloudless sky, and a light breeze shook the limbs of the cottonwood trees that lined the sidewalks. A man in a simple work jacket stood surveying the stream of pedestrians. His name was Thomas Merton, better known to his fellow monks at the Abbey of Gethsemane as Father Louis. He had traveled to Louisville shopping district in civilian clothes to pick up some printed material for his abbey's novices, as he was the novice director at the time. He squinted in amazement at the swirl of activity around him, the traffic, the pedestrians. His wonder soon gave way to something deeper. He would write later that day in his journal, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I was theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. Certainly that passage is familiar to many, if not all of you. It's come to be known as Merton's so-called Louisville Epiphany, or the Epiphany at 4th and Walnut. And the very corner where Merton stood and had that epiphany is now memorialized with a plaque and a street sign that says Thomas Merton Square, though Walnut Street was later renamed Muhammad Ali Boulevard in honor of another of Louisville's favorite sons. As many times as I've seen this passage and read this passage, I never grow tired of thinking about the meaning of Merton's words and the significance of what took place that day in his heart and in his attitude and perspective on the world outside the monastery. Joining the monastery, Merton wanted to turn away from the chaos of the world as he knew it. But at 4th and Walnut, he begins once again turning toward the world. In his journal, he describes the overwhelming impact that this experience at 4th and Walnut had on him. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world, the world of renunciation and supposed holiness. To think that such a commonplace realization should suddenly seem like news that one holds the winning ticket in a cosmic sweepstakes. The important thing here is that something significant changed in Merton's worldview. He had thought of monks as those living at the margins of society. Now he grasped that even a monk living separately from the many distractions and attachments of the world was still in the world, and indeed had a responsibility to speak to the world, about the world. In fact, living on the margins of society, Merton reasoned, a monk could possibly see more clearly, speak more accurately of what is taking place in the world. As he later wrote in his book, Contemplation in a World of Action, I am simply the voice of a self-questioning human person who struggles to cope with turbulent, mysterious, demanding, exciting, confused existence in which everything public is patently phony. Kind of reminds you of our political situation today. Merton was so prescient to write this decades ago. Those of us who have witnessed these past few years of so-called alternative facts and attempts by some to replace objective reality with false narratives know all too well what Merton is talking about there. That last line where he says, in which almost everything public is patently phony, speaks so loudly to the lies and distortions to which we have been subjected in the last several years. Lies repeated so often that they've become lodged in the public consciousness. I'd like to turn now to look at some of the issues that preoccupied Merton after his epiphany on 4th and Walnut. They are issues that confound us still today: the proliferation of nuclear weapons, the oppression of indigenous people around the world, and one of the continuing pressing issues of his day and our day, the disparities in justice for African Americans and other minorities in this country. Merton was also ahead of his time in decrying the pervasive power of corporations, the influence of advertising and mass media in cultivating unhealthy consumer appetites, as well as the ever-growing encroachment of technology into our daily lives. Decades before cell phones, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, email, texting, and all the rest, Merton figured out that access to instantaneous forms of communication did not necessarily translate into greater communion. Listen to what he had to say in the 1950s, when there was no 24-hour cable news, no internet, no social media. There are times then when, in order to keep ourselves in existence at all, we simply have to sit back for a while and do nothing. And for a person who has let himself be drowned completely out of himself by activity, nothing is more difficult than to sit still and rest and do nothing at all. The very act of resting is the hardest and most courageous act one can perform, and it is often quite beyond our power. As he began engaging more with the issues of the times, Merton found a sounding board, you might even say an alter ego, in none other than Dorothy Day. Day's Catholic Worker newspaper gave Merton a platform for sharing his thoughts, even after his superiors in the Trappist order directed him to stop writing about social and political issues. They especially wanted him to stop writing about his opposition to war and nuclear weapons. They thought writing about such topics was unbefitting of a monk and would cause scandal to the order. Luckily for Merton, none other than Pope John XXIII was writing about these same issues. In his seminal 1963 encyclical Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, John the 23rd denounced nuclear weapons. Mind you, there were still Catholic bishops at the time encouraging people to build fallout shelters in their backyards. But both Merton and Day rightly pointed out that no amount of air raid drills and fallout shelters would allow anyone to survive a nuclear war. In a critique of society that could have been composed today, Merton wrote to Day in August 1960, "We have lost our sense of values and vision. We love fatness, health-bursting smiles, the radiance of satisfied bodies, all properly fed and rested and sated and washed and perfumed and sexually relieved. Anything else is a horror and a scandal to us. How sad, for I am part of the society which has these illusions, and I can't help sharing its guilt, its illusions." For me, Merton's words there bring to mind the armed protesters that showed up at state capitals during the height of the COVID pandemic, demanding that businesses reopen to move the economy forward, despite the fact that thousands of workers were dying daily of the virus. Or the folks who stormed the Capitol building, believing the 2020 election had been stolen. Or those who cheered during the last presidential campaign at the mention of deporting millions of asylum seekers and refugees. In words that seem as valid today as when he wrote them in 1963, Merton said, "When we call ourselves the free world, we mean, first of all, a world in which business is free, and the freedom of persons comes only after that." And he added, "It is not the life of the spirit that is real to us, but the vitality of the market." And we see this in debates today over increasing the minimum wage and whether to raise taxes on corporations and the wealthiest 10% of Americans, and of course, in the debate over immigration. Merton and Day also understood our human propensity to seek out quote unquote enemies and create false narratives about the other. We see this again today, not just in how immigrants are viewed by some of our fellow citizens, but how transgender individuals are viewed, and members of the LGBTQ community, and anyone who perhaps doesn't ascribe to a particular religious belief. In his book, No Man is an Island, Merton writes, "Violence rests on the assumption that the enemy and I are entirely different. The enemy is evil, and I am good. The enemy must be destroyed, and I saved. But love sees things differently. It sees that the enemy suffers from the same sorrows and limitations that I do. Death is the same for both of us. Death is his enemy and mine." Like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Dorothy Day, Merton came to believe that nonviolence is the only rational answer to resolving conflict. And Merton expresses these thoughts in a famous essay called "The Root of War is Fear," found at the end of his book, New Seeds of Contemplation. And I encourage everyone to read this essay if you haven't already. And that said, some of the most powerful writing Merton did on race, war, peace, and nonviolence is actually found, in my humble opinion, in his poetry. There he lays out masterfully the futility, the absurdity of the violence we perpetrate against one another. So with your permission, I would like to take a look at some of these poems. One of Merton's most famous and powerful anti-war poems is Chant to be used in processions around a site with furnaces. It is, of course, about Auschwitz. And the poem is written ostensibly in the voice of the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Hess. In the poem, Merton quotes from official documents and transcripts of the trials of Nazi war criminals. So using that kind of official language is what, to me, gives these anti-war poems their immense power. In Chant to be used in processions, Merton sought to also show the banality of evil. The poem forces us to ask, what would make otherwise ordinary human beings engage in such monumental acts of inhumanity as the Nazi death camps? Merton would say, it is when we let go of our humanity that such things happen. Dorothy Day published this poem in the Catholic Worker newspaper in 1961. So here's the start of the poem. Listen for how nonchalantly the speaker in the poem talks about things like Zyklon B, the chemical used to gas inmates, or how he euphemistically describes the gas chambers as cleaning appointments and a place where people simply go to sleep. How we made them sleep and purified them. How I commanded. I made cleaning appointments, and then I made the travelers sleep, and after that, I made soap. I was born into a Catholic family, but these people were not going to need a priest. I did not become a priest. I installed a perfectly good machine. It gave satisfaction to many. When trains arrived, the soiled passengers received appointments for fun in the bathroom they did not guess. They would be given a greeting card to send home, taken care of with good jobs, wishing you would come to our joke. Another improvement I made was I built the chambers for 2,000 invitations at a time. The naked votaries were disinfected with Zyklon B. Children of tender age were always invited by reason of their youth. They were unable to work. They were marked out for play. They were washed like the others and more than the others. Merton employed a similar technique in a poem called Epitaph for a Public Servant, written after he read that the psychiatrist who examined the Nazi SS chief Adolf Eichmann following the war had determined that Eichmann was indeed quite sane. And this is a brief excerpt from sections 2 and 3 of what's a very long poem. And the poem, again, like this poem is in the voice of Hess, the poem is in the voice of Adolf Eichmann. And the capital letters that you'll see in the poem are Merton's. I never harbored any ill feeling against the Jews during this entire transaction. I even walked through the streets with a Jewish friend. He thought nothing of it. Yet I was saddened at the order. I lost all joy in my work. To regain my joy without any reason, I joined the party. I was swallowed by the party. Without previous decision, I entered upon my apprenticeship in Jewish affairs. From then on, official orders were my only language. Repentance is for little children. So you can see here how Merton uses these rather short declarative sentences to show how monstrous acts of evil can be made to sound banal, quotidian, dare I say, even rational. And Merton uses a similar technique to great effect in another of his famous anti-war poems called Original Child Bomb. It's a prose poem whose words are lifted almost entirely from historical documents describing the dropping of the first atomic bomb. And throughout the poem, Merton deftly shows us how the language of war corrupts and distorts ordinary human speech. The title comes from the name the Japanese actually gave to the first atomic explosion, child bomb. The Japanese sensed all too well that on August 6, 1945, human history had given birth to an irrevocable evil, and that the original child bomb would likely generate far more offspring over the course of history. The very scientists handling the bomb referred to it as little boy. The military reverted to religious imagery, codenaming the test site for the A-bomb in New Mexico, Trinity. The radio call sign for the aircraft that carried the bomb to Hiroshima was called Dimples. Tinian Island, the launching point for the atomic attacks on Japan, was codenamed Papacy. I mean, you cannot make this stuff up. Now, the poem is much too long to cite in its entirety, but I do encourage everyone to look it up and read it. But here, I'll just quote the powerful ending lines to the poem, in which Merton speaks about the soldiers who were ordered to drop the bomb. The men in the plane perceived that the raid had been successful, but then they thought of the people and the city, and they were not perfectly happy. Some felt they had done wrong, but in any case, they obeyed orders. It was war. I'd like to turn now to another crisis that was unfolding in Merton's time and continues to perplex us even today, and that is the issue of race. After George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, igniting the Black Lives Matter movement, I began reading for the first time the series of essays Merton wrote in 1963 called Letters to a White Liberal. While our country has undoubtedly made progress on race issues since then, I couldn't help thinking, reading these essays, that here we are, some 60 years later, still grappling with so many of the same challenges. Merton recognized, even back then, that racial injustice cannot be mitigated by laws alone. It is a collective evil, he said, that must be addressed in each individual heart. Merton said racism is not a burden to be borne and eradicated solely by people of color. It is a cancer eating away at the souls of white people, Merton said. The cancer of injustice and hate which is eating white society, he wrote, is rooted in the heart of the white man himself. Now, if you can forgive the outmoded masculine language Merton frequently uses, it was, after all, the language of his times, he actually makes a number of relevant points in these essays. And here is a passage of his that helped me understand the struggles of the summer of 2020, in which violence broke out in many of our cities after George Floyd's death. The Black person Merton wrote, finally gets tired of his treatment and becomes rightly convinced that the only way he is ever going to get his rights is by fighting for them for himself. We warn him against violence, and in some cases even provoke it in the hope that the whole movement for freedom can be repressed by force. It is curious that the ones who repeatedly lecture the Black community on law and order, Merton wrote, are themselves in league with murderers and thugs. It's pretty powerful and unsettling stuff that Merton is giving us here. But the thing to remember is that Merton saw struggles with race as a potential moment of grace for people of faith. The important question to ask ourselves, Merton said, is not what is going to happen in our country, but what are we going to do? Otherwise, the moment of grace will pass without effect. Now, the question of race relations was personal for Merton. This is a photo from Look magazine in 1963 of Carol Denise McNair, one of 4 young girls killed in that year's bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Merton saw this photograph, cut it out, and kept it. He also wrote a letter of condolence to Carol Denise's father, a complete stranger to him, and dedicated one of his most famous poems to Carol Denise, a poem he titled Black Child with White Doll. It is too long a poem to cite here, but I encourage everyone to look it up and read it if you haven't already done so. In April 1968, the day after Dr. King was shot, Merton wrote a personal letter to Coretta Scott King. And here is an image of that letter. And I'll just read the words in case it's hard for you to read on the PowerPoint. So 1 second here, I have to adjust my screen myself. Some events are too big and too terrible to talk about. I think we all anticipated this one. I am sure he did. Somehow when John Youngblood was an activist for civil rights, somehow when John Youngblood spoke of Martin coming here for a brief retreat before the big march, I had the awful feeling that it might be a preparation for something like this. It was to be in Memphis instead of Washington or somewhere else on the way. Let me only say how deeply I share your personal grief, as well as the shock which pervades the whole nation. He has done the greatest thing anyone can do. In imitation of his master, he has laid down his life for his friends and enemies. He knew the nation was under judgment, and he tried everything to stay the hand of God and man. He will go down in history as one of our greatest citizens. My prayers are with you and with him. May he find the rest and reward which God has promised to all who trust in his mercy. This morning, my Eucharistic offering will be for him and for you. And it was signed, Thomas Merton. I just can't help wondering, what official of the church today would have the gravitas that, I'm sorry, let me go back here, would have the gravitas and the credibility of Merton to write such a letter, say, to the family of Breonna Taylor or Trayvon Martin or someone else who died in under terrible circumstances. King's assassination, as you see in this letter, was a particularly painful shock for Merton because he had been arranging for Dr. King to come to the Abbey of Gethsemane on retreat that very month. But King postponed the visit to Gethsemane and instead went to Memphis to intervene in a garbage worker strike, as we all know, and that is where he was shot. Merton himself would die just 9 months later, in December 1968, while on a visit to Bangkok. But here's a poem that Merton wrote in April of 1968, shortly after the King assassination. And it's based on news reports that he had seen. And notice how certain phrases are repeated throughout the poem, so that it's written as a kind of responsorial psalm. So I'll read the poem for you. It's called April 4th, 1968. On a rainy night in April, when everybody ran, said the minister, on a balcony of a hotel in Tennessee, we came at once upstairs. On a rainy night in April, when the shot was fired, said the minister, we came at once upstairs and found him lying after the tornado on the balcony. We came upstairs. On a rainy night, he was our hope, and we found a tornado, said the minister. And a well-dressed white man, said the minister, dropped the telescopic storm. And he ran, the well-dressed minister of death. He ran away. And on that balcony, said the minister, we found everybody dying. It is still very moving to me that this was one of the final poems Merton wrote before his own death. I want to turn now to what is perhaps Merton's most enduring message for us in crisis times, living in crisis times. As much as he believed we have a responsibility to read the signs of the times in which we live and respond to the urgencies of those times, he understood that change is an interior process, one that begins in the depths of the heart. He understood, too, that if we try to fix what lies broken outside of us, we need to also do the necessary work to address the disorders in our own hearts. This is such a necessary insight in our current tumultuous times. And Merton distills this idea in one of my favorite passages from his essay that I mentioned previously, The Root of War is Fear. Instead of hating the people you think are war makers, hate the appetites and disorders in your own soul, which are the causes of war. If you love peace, then hate injustice, hate tyranny, hate greed, but hate these things in yourself, not in another. In the final analysis, Merton believed a life of prayer, a life of contemplation and compassion, and esteem for silence furnishes us with the wherewithal to live a life free from conflict and useless care. And a life free from conflict and useless care, he said, is a life free from fear, a life free to love. And like his friend Dorothy Day, he never lost hope in the mercy of God. He never stopped believing in what he called, what Dorothy Day called the duty of hope. And here is perhaps my favorite of all Merton's passages from all of his writings. These are words I come back to time and again when I feel despair about the state of our world. It is a passage he wrote in his autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain. On the contrary, consider how, in spite of centuries of sin and greed and lust and cruelty and hatred and avarice and oppression and injustice, spawned and bred by the free wills of men, the human race can still recover each time and can still produce men and women who overcome evil with good, hatred with love, greed with charity, lust and cruelty with sanctity. It leads us full circle to that epiphany he had on the corner of 4th and Walnut Streets in downtown Louisville. That day, Merton says, he saw each person around him as another Christ, another Christ. And he wrote, it was as if I suddenly saw the secret beauty of their hearts. If only they could all see themselves as they really are. If only we could see each other that way all the time. But there is no way of telling people they are walking around shining like the sun. This is the gift of wisdom, mercy, and compassion Merton strove mightily to impart. It is the gift we are called to share in our wounded, fragmented, and fragile world. Thank you for your kind attention, and thanks be to God. Let's take just a moment of silence to reflect on what we heard, the images we saw, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts, your comments, your questions. So John, how would you like to proceed?
First of all, a big thank you. Dear friends, join me in thanking Judith for this beautiful meditation. That was beautiful, Judith, and not what I expected. And you were so helpful. The slides really worked, the pictures worked, but then you took us using Merton's poems to look at the crises of the world and to lead us into a deeper level, which is what Merton would try to do. So that was a great gift. I heard you talking to us about seeing each person as another Christ, and without saying it, but inviting all of us to have a 4th and Walnut experience or live that out as we go forward into the new year. To engage the world as Martin did after 4th and Walnut, and to approach these crises in that deep level that led him to write poetry, which is the deep level of contemplation and wisdom and compassion and empathy that's very disarming, but also political. It's amazing to me the witness that this man had, a monk alone in the woods, writing 150 books and speaking to the whole world and being, Thich Nhat Hanh to me called him the Buddha, a Buddha for our time. And he was an enlightened figure, as he said the same thing to me about Dr. King. And so it was a great gift. Thank you. I took notes and I loved it. It makes me want to go back and read his poems in a quiet way. I'm aware that we are not monks, and that Merton helps remind us of the need for contemplation and wisdom and solitude, but that we're called to be peacemakers and to step into the culture and to be instruments of God's peace. So on behalf of everybody, thanks, Judith. And I'm not too good at this, but I didn't see one question. So let me ask you to raise your hand or go into the React thing and press the yellow hand raise, and I'll call on you. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking and asking Judith's questions myself, and nobody wants that. So, who would like to ask questions? Or I might even call on you if no one does. But you're very welcome to ask a question or share a reflection on Merton, where you are with Merton these days in these difficult times in light of all that Judith shared with us. There's so many deep levels.
Yeah, I'm curious if anything that Merton said changed your perspective. I talked about how reading his letters to a white liberal after George Floyd's death, really had an effect on me. So if anything, anything caused you to think about something a little bit differently, a perspective, I'd love to hear your reflections on that.
You're not asking me, you're asking the group, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, great. That'd be great.
And you as part of the group.
hmm I see Paul has a question about his death, but does anybody have a question about the topic of Merton's wisdom in a time of crisis and these poems? Okay, Trey, and then John. You can unmute yourself.
Hi, I just wondered if
Real
you
loud. Can't hear you, Trey.
um this is Judy Traeger.
Oh, hi, Judy.
Hi. I just wondered if you could possibly put up that last quote again from Seven Story Mountain that you said was your favorite. I'd
Oh,
like to
absolutely.
hold on to that. Thank you.
Absolutely. And let's see, I'm going to go to share screen again. And
Thank
Maybe
you.
you could tell us a little more about why it's your favorite of all the things he wrote, Judith.
yeah, yeah,
Basically, he's saying there's always hope, I think.
yeah. I mean, it's very typical of Merton. Like he could be very depressed. Excuse me, I'm trying to get that slide up for Judy. He could be very depressed. Judy, uh, it's not coming right up here for me.
That's
So
okay then.
let me work on that a little bit.
We'll call on somebody else, and when you get it, you can come
But
back to it.
that,
Thank you,
that,
Judy.
that quote is very, very significant, especially at this time, because I don't know about some of you, but I have trouble sleeping at night after watching the news these days and things that are being proposed to happen in our country, the country that I love. And Merton is saying what I love is that line in there about this centuries of doing bad things. Despite centuries of doing bad things, we always come back to love and mercy and compassion. And it's something that a friend wrote to me the other day about, we could start to feel quite alone at this time, quite alone in our preoccupations and our worries. But she wrote something about we're not alone. Christ is with us, and Christ is within us. And I think that's what Merton was saying there, that Christ is always going to be in it, and you see that too in the writings sometimes of the people who were in the Holocaust, which was just the probably the most inhumane thing that you could possibly imagine human beings doing to other human beings. And yet, there were people who were able to find God in that. And so that's why I love that passage. Thank you for
Thank
asking.
you, Judith. John from Cleveland, go ahead and unmute yourself there and ask your question.
Hi, everyone. What a great presentation, Judith. It was fantastic. Thank you. This is going to be more of a comment than a question, but I was introduced to Thomas Merton's writings in 1968 when I was a college freshman in Atchison, Kansas at St. Benedict's College. And one of the new faculty members there, Luke Flaherty, was devastated when Thomas Merton died. And Luke had just written his master's thesis on Thomas Merton's poem, Cables to the Ace.
Hmm.
And he had met Merton, and Merton had given him a copy of that book. And as a result of being introduced to Thomas Merton's writings, I started studying a little about nonviolence and was eventually became a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War, and a person of nonviolent thinking because of Thomas Merton. So I have Thomas Merton to thank for that. More recently, when I was being introduced to centering prayer at an Episcopal church in Cleveland, we started reading one of Merton's books. This was 8 years ago. We started reading Thoughts in Solitude. And I still had my copy that I had when I was a college student in 1968, the one that cost 95 cents, and other of Thomas Merton's books that I had kept with me. And so I started rereading much of what Merton had written. And I then had the very, very fortunate opportunity to attend 4 week-long retreats or 4-day retreats at Gethsemane, the Abbey of Gethsemane. And I am just so thankful for having been introduced to Thomas Merton and to not only that, and at the Abbey of Gethsemane, we have the link with Bobby Kennedy Sr., his wife, Ethel Kennedy, had made many trips to visit the Abbey of Gethsemane, and her family had donated money for the refurbishment of one of the chapels there. So 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, Thomas Merton died. And in my mind, those were all sources of non-violent thinking that we as a country lost all at once. And that was a devastating year for us, for the nonviolence. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I'm delighted to be here with everyone today and look forward to seeing you in Denver in June.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Let me call on Bob Cushing.
Thanks, John. And thanks again, Judith, for your presentation. Very helpful, insightful. One of my favorite Merton quotes, I'll just read it. It's not too long. And I'd like to hear yourself and John respond, and anyone else, because it's kind of like got me out of a lot of double binds that I put myself into as a person who takes on too much. So this is the quote. There's a pervasive form of contemporary violence to which the idealist fighting for peace by nonviolent methods most easily succumbs: activism and overwork. The rush and pressure of modern life are a form, perhaps the most common form, of its innate violence. To allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender to too many projects, to want to help everyone and everything, is to succumb to violence. More than that, it is cooperation in violence. The frenzy of the activist neutralizes one's work for peace. It destroys one's inner capacity for peace. It destroys the fruitfulness of one's work because it kills the root of inner wisdom, which makes work fruitful. Comments?
I love that quote too. And I think about it often as a person probably like yourself, Mark, who takes on too many projects and tries to do too many things, be all things to all people. And I like what strikes me in that passage is what he talks about: doing violence to ourselves by overworking ourselves, overscheduling ourselves. And that's he wasn't living in an age when there were all these other distractions that we now have today. How much time do you spend on Facebook or Instagram? Or I don't really like social media, but I have to do it. I have to keep in touch with people. I have to talk to the people who read my books and talk to the people who are interested in Merton and this and that. So yeah, that's a very powerful passage. of Merton's. Thank you for reading that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Bob.
Yeah,
It helped me a lot.
Judy Emery had a good question in the chat, and Judy's was a friend of Eileen Egan, a great peace activist who was a friend of Merton's, and Judy Emery, in fact, was a neighbor to Eileen Egan, and also Judy, I think you knew Dorothy Day as well, if I'm
Can
not.
I just hold on and make a comment before we go to
absolutely,
Judy?
absolutely.
I just wanted to say it's such a powerful passage, and it had a big impact on me when I was a kid, Bob, you know, and led me to really to begin the long journey of inner nonviolence, inner disarming the heart, self-care, self-compassion, making peace with myself as a way to learn how to make peace with others, and to see that doing total workaholism is just another manifestation of ego and our own self-will, as opposed to doing the will of God, as opposed to total surrender to God, which is what I'm interested in now. And however, I was raised by Daniel Berrigan, who I maintain was Merton's best friend. And you know, Dan, so I'm going to hold on mute somebody here. Dan, you know, never recovered from Merton's death and was idolized Merton. And Merton loved Dan. And I think Merton turned against Dan. And Dan kind of never recovered from that. And I think Dorothy Day had a lot of issues with Merton, and so did Thich Nhat Hanh, who told me so. And that's all very interesting to me. Like, I wonder what Merton was going on there to say all that. His main experience was Jim Forrest, who was a really overworked young activist who had a lot of problems, who I identify with. So but what was what was going on with him? He seemed to be working way too hard for a hermit and a monk.
Yeah.
And it was a problem he had. And he had an opinion on everything, and he was a little judgmental. In other words, after living with Dan and Judith, I want you to respond to all this. I began to wonder about some of Merton's pronouncements. And I remember he's a monk. He's a monk, and we are not monks. And the same with Thich Nhat Hanh. He was a monk, and we are not monks. I have decided I don't like Merton's way of prayer. I never really bought into Keating's centering prayer, because that's good for a monk. But we're in the world, and that's why I like Ignatian spirituality. We need Jesus. We're being sent into this world, and Merton's our guru, but we do have to go into the world. Judith, I'm just musing with you. What do you think about this? And then we'll go to Judy Emery.
Well, I'm sorry, I called you Mark. It was Bob who was speaking there, right? I'm sorry. I saw Mark's hand up. Anyway, apologize, Bob. No, I think Merton was speaking to himself there, because he was
Yeah.
a complete workaholic, a crazy workaholic. So I think
Yeah.
he was talking to himself there, as he often does in speaking to us. He's speaking to himself. So you know,
That's helpful.
what
Thank you.
I like is the balance between the contemplative. I was a Jesuit. I was educated by the Jesuits, and I like their idea of contemplation and action, that we need the balance. We need the balance between contemplation and action. That one is not, you know, you can't have one without the other and be effective. And I think Dorothy Day, you know, and Judy Emery, I think, knew Dorothy Day. She could speak to that as well as I can. You know, I mean, Day was, you know, was very contemplative in her way. She was a Benedictine oblate. I mean, she did the Liturgy of the Hours every day. She went to Mass every day. Eileen Egan went to Mass every day. Eileen Egan was contemplative. You knew Eileen as well, Father John. So, you know, I think you have to have both. You know, Merton, yes, he was way over on the other side of the scale, because he was a monk. And look, it's odd that when he starts going out in the world, what happens? He dies. He gets electrocuted. You know, somebody put a question in there, you know, can you talk about Merton's death? Well, you know, he had an accidental death from what we could tell. He plugged in a fan after he came out of a shower in Bangkok and got electrocuted. And there are people who think, oh, there was a conspiracy behind it. We're never going to know that. We're never going to know that, you know. So we're never going to know anything other than it was just a tragic, tragic accident.
Okay. I don't see. Well, let's go to, since you brought her up, Judith Emery, wherever you are, if that's your name, I'm sorry. Unmute yourself and give us your question for Judith. I don't see you.
My question was,
There you are, Judy Emery.
Hey, Judy.
both for Judith and for you, John. What is your take on Merton's a Peace in the Post-Christian Era, the book?
Go ahead, Judith.
You go ahead. You go ahead. You're the expert.
No, you know, I was looking at it this week, that and his book Cold War Letters, and for something I've been writing, and they're just incredible. And so they're written about the war on communism, but they could be the same thing today, just translated for which capitalism, war in general, fascism, nationalism. We can go down the list. The war on terrorism 20 years ago, when they came out, I wrote a blurb for it, and that's what I said. Just changed from war on communism to war on terrorism, and it's the same book. It's the same message for now. Well, that was in 2002, and right now it's for this growing nationalism. Well, we're in a post-Christian era. That's for sure. And what does it mean to be Christian? I think it means to be a disciple of the nonviolent Jesus, to live the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount, to be a person of universal love, universal compassion, universal peace. That's what I get from Merton. Therefore, a person of total nonviolence sent into the world. And you hear very few people talking like that. And here this guy, long before anybody, continues to grow and becomes such a prophetic voice. Judith, it's still astonishing that Martin, what he did. And I guess, Judy, in general, I would say, if Merton could do all of that, living in a tiny cell and then living in the woods and end up speaking to the whole world, and he has got none of the skills, I mean, literally the apparatus that we have, Zoom. What the heck are we doing as we're going into the apocalypse and the end of the world with climate change and nuclear war? I think one thing that we can learn is that we too have to figure out how to speak about peace prophetically. And every single one of us can now with the technology or in our lives. And that's part of what we're doing today with Judith's wisdom, is what I was hoping is we can begin to dig deeper contemplative roots as we prepare for 2025 and the second coming of Trump, so to speak. We want to be contemplatives, but I think we want to be prophetic voices for peace and the wisdom of nonviolence and contemplation and compassion. And, you know, those lines that Judith read from No Man is an Island about there is no more enemy, it's we love everyone. And really, death is the same for all of us. And what we're really up against is death. And really, Merton might have been talking about the Vietnam War. Today, it's the war on the poor, war on people of color, war on the creatures, war on earth, war on the whole human race. And it's, you know, it's a system of death that's coming a lot faster than we thought. How can we speak up? And I'll end with that. You know, that's what I've been thinking a lot, Judith, as you were reflecting, that Merton teaches me, calls me to be a contemplative, someone who sits in silence. Merton meditated 7 hours a day. That's always shocked me. If you add the office, the hours of the monastic life, plus his own private prayer, he's listening to the God of peace. And then he ends up speaking to the culture of war, the good news of the message of peace. That's what our task is as we go forward here. To be contemplatives who listen to God like never before, and then to speak out with as much love and wisdom and universality as we can, this good news of peace, which means total nonviolence. And we can always go, I just go back, I look at Merton every day, Judy. I have a problem. I've been reading him every day since 1980, Judy Emery. Judith, what do you think?
No, ditto to everything that you said there. Judy Emery, do you have thoughts on that particular book? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Well, just that everything you said, but that it helps in so many ways because Merton lays out, I think, all these reasons for why war is just impossible, that it's all wrong, that it doesn't work. But he gives you that, uh that vision from practically the beginning of the church. He goes through a lot of the historical uh relationships of the church and war. And so you have a good foundation, I think, for moving ahead.
Thank you,
Thank
Judy.
you. Thank you, Judy. Thank you so much.
Judith, is there a question you want to turn to, or could I call on Carolyn Whitney Brown?
Yeah, please call on. There's some folks that have had their hand raised for a while. Mark
Okay.
and Nancy, and then I think Lizanne had her hand raised for a while.
So you call on them, Judith.
Okay, I think Mark and then Nancy and then Lizanne, and then I think you saw a person who wanted
Okay, great. Go ahead. And by the way, we have 7 minutes left, so we'll keep it short and sweet, everybody. Thanks so much.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'll keep it short and sweet. Thank you, Father John and Judith. I just wanted to share how moved I was by this presentation, and it has a tremendous personal connection to my life. My dad was a nuclear veteran, and he died the night before Merton's death, December 9th, 1968, from the ionizing radiation during his tour of duty in the Korean War in the Nevada test sites. So he was 40 years of age and I was just 12. I just turned 12. And on his tombstone, Burton is part of my life for all these years. It is written on his tombstone, my dad's tombstone, and then my mom's as well. Our world without storms and our lives without agony would give us nothing to grow on. Make us glad for stormy weather. Thomas Merton.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
I just shared just soon after that, I was abused in the church and talking about stormy weather and Merton as being part of my life. And I just want to share that I'm just so grateful that Orbis has just released my book a couple of days ago called Torrent of Grace, A Catholic Survivor's Healing Journey After Clergy Abuse.
Beautiful.
And
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Nancy.
Oh, thank you, Bob. I'm a Quaker, so I pause a lot, but I'll try to quicken here. When you speak of Daniel Berrigan, I can't help but think of William Stringfellow.
Yeah.
And that leads me to an ethic for Christians and aliens in a strange land. And that leads me to looking at this biblically. His phrase was powers and principalities.
Yeah.
And as a contemplative and an activist, for me, that has to be part of active prayer and acknowledgement of what's going on so as not to personalize the atrocities, but to know that there's another force field that's present. Thanks.
Thank you, Nancy. Judith, you want to comment on that?
No, it's well said. Thank
Yeah, it's so helpful as we head into the new year. I hear you saying, Nancy, there's no one, like St. Paul writes, there's no one person, not even Trump. It's the system of principalities and powers.
you.
And I've been thinking that throughout your talk, Judith, that I mean, Merton published his autobiography in 1947, 48. He's writing this World War II, and he explodes on the world stage, and then he has such an influence and he's such an inspiration to the great figures of his time, Dorothy Day, Daniel Berrigan, Thich Nhat Hanh, Martin Luther King. We could go down the list. What I was thinking, Nancy, was that he never wrote a book on Jesus. He hardly ever wrote a word about Jesus, Merton. But neither did Dorothy or Daniel Berrigan or Thich Nhat Hanh or Stringfellow. And those people didn't write much on nonviolence. Merton wrote more in that. And I used to talk about this with Daniel Berrigan and was trying to get him to write a book on Jesus and couldn't. And that's why I was so moved when Henry Nouwen kind of appeared and started writing about Jesus. Now we have a lot more. Anyway, all of these things are great helpful threads. But Merton was such a foundational teacher for everybody. And here we are on the brink, as all of them warned us. And we have to gain all the wisdom we can from all these great teachers. And we have to rise to the occasion and stand like them as wisdom figures and public peacemakers, I think, in this new world. And I'm trying to encourage all of us not to give in to despair, but instead to regroup and recenter and to re-strengthen ourselves and to be kind of fearless like Merton and all these great people and go forward in the new year ready to speak and stand out and speak out. So I think then I'll call on Carolyn Whitney Brown. If you go ahead and Carrie and unmute yourself.
I'm not sure I have anything to add to what you just said. I just wanted to hear if
Yeah,
there's
ask about Merton.
just something about Merton's sense of humor, because there's a kind of, buoyancy in him or something about, the only known picture of God of addressing the snake, in his outhouse in a kind of, there's a very dark humor in the poetry you were reading earlier, obviously, but there's also a kind of buoyancy that, as John says, we're going to need that going into this new time, into this new year.
Yeah,
So I just wanted you to talk about Merton's sense of humor.
He actually was very humorous. I'm sorry, who wanted to go? Was that Father John? Was that you?
No, go ahead. Go ahead,
No,
Judith.
I mean the people, the monks who are still alive, who were novices under him, will say he was very funny. I mean the snake story that you told. He would go in open the outhouse door when he went to the hermitage and say, "Are you in there, you bastard?" and then one time one of the monks said that one of the toilets that they used to go from their classes to the toilet in between classes was out of order. And Merton said, well, what are you complaining about? And he waved his arm and looked at the fields. He said, the whole place is a toilet. you know, he was a funny guy. He really was. I mean, he was a depressive guy as well. I mean, he was a paradoxical guy, but he was very complex character.
He's such a genius, and I mean, true genius. I like Judith and Carolyn, his letters to Robert Lax, the anti-letters, which are so funny and so crazy. They're equal to Bob Dylan, subterranean
Whom he
homes.
admired.
Huh?
Whom he admired. He loved
He
Dylan.
loved Merton and I mean, he loved Bob Dylan. Yeah. So great and so much fun. And who wrote that? It's there in the biographies that Merton had no sense that everybody who came and was with him was just overwhelmed. He was so full of life. And the rest of it, even when he's dealing with chant to be used in a procession around furnaces. Holy Toledo, but he's full of life, and I think that's the way the saints are. Like Tutu was like that. I think Dr. King was like that. Certainly my experience of Daniel Berrigan. Recently they said C.S. Lewis was like that. That would make sense to me. These real geniuses are really funny and really love everybody, and that's a path too. Gandhi was like that too.
Yeah, and there's something I worry about that if we don't highlight that or find a way to name it or articulate it or keep finding that, then we get both a wrong picture of people.
Mhm.
That's one of my things about Henry Nouwen too, that it's really easy to turn them into people who are just anguished and heavy and do the work. And that's fantastic. But John, it's one of the things I love about you, that you're fun. You're funny. You make being in community and doing that work together fun. And I want to know more about Merton. I just want to know more about that kind of buoyancy that we need, or we'll, if
It's
it's
so
not
great.
fun, it's not worth doing. Yeah.
Judith, Carolyn lived and worked with Henry Nouwen for many years at L'Arche in his last year. So, and she's
Ah,
a friend of mine. Yeah, you said find a word for it. Actually, I do think it's a joy. It's an inner joy that Merton had, and King had, and Gandhi had, and Dan Berrigan had, and Dorothy Day eventually had, and Tutu had, and Rosa Parks had, and that's the Christian thing. Judith, it would be really interesting to do a talk on Merton's little tiny book. It's really just a 6-page essay on resurrection. Christ
mhm.
is risen, which I have spent a lot of time with. I don't know you all if you've all read it. It's hard to find, actually. Um, but it's just sentences, and it's really good. It's really helpful to me because I think, and I know this with Dan, and I bet you he got it from Merton, that first and foremost, they were people of resurrection, and that they just death does not get the last word.
Mm.
And isn't that what you quoted? And it's something about in No Man is an Island, that death is the same for both of us, but we're not people of death. So that when the monk died, and you heard he had died you know, the first thing you said was Alleluia. And the visitors thought that was weird. You don't say Alleluia when your best friend has just died. Yeah, you do if you believe. And that's the spirit. What do you think, Carolyn? A bit of resurrection and a bit of joy. Like we can't let this, as Dan wrote in his Merton poem after Merton's death, we can't let them steal our joy.
Yeah, and if we're in a post-Christian era, let's be careful not to be in a post-joy era. We aren't in a post-joy era. We aren't in a
No, we
post-resurrection
don't let the
era. Joy and
culture name
resurrection
us.
has gotta stay.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Hey, I think we should stay on another 4 hours, but that wasn't in the contract. And maybe we ought to stop there. Would that be okay, Judith?
Yeah,
For
and thank
now?
you for, your really good comments, and Carolyn, thank you. You've given me an idea for a Tuesdays with Merton talk, Merton's humor. So stay tuned. We'll try to
Well, so now tell us about the Tuesdays with Merton. Tell us about the International Merton Society and the upcoming convention, and tell us how we can reach you.
Okay. Yeah, certainly. And our secretary, Michael Moore, is on the call too. And we're going to be in Denver at Regis University in June, mid-June. If you want to look at the speakers, there's tremendous speakers. The theme this year is Merton and snow. Help me out here, Michael. Snow, sky, and something. The Merton and the inner landscape, or Merton and place. Merton and the spirit. No, Merton and the spirit of place. And that's the theme this year. But also, a good way to know more about the Merton Society is to come on the Tuesdays with Merton talks. It's completely free. You don't have to be a member of the society. Just go to merton.org. Michael put the link in the chat. Michael Moore put the link in the chat. And we've had tremendous speakers like Jim Finlay and oh gosh, we've had so many good ones. I'm thinking of help me out here, Michael. Some of the other main,
Well,
all the main voices who are still living. Jim Forrest, before he died, was one of the speakers, and these are taped, so you could also go on the website and see the taped ones.
here's the title. It's The Calligraphy of Snow and Rock and Sky, Thomas Merton and the Spirit of Place.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Great.
Yeah,
Well,
now you know why it was a really long title. I couldn't remember the whole thing.
and
Yeah,
your
the-
website, Judith,
Huh? The
your
website?
website,
Yeah, merton.org. You'll
and
find
your website.
mine. Oh, judithvalente.com. And Valente is with an E, Valente,
Great.
judithvalente.com.
And you give talks and retreats in case people want to bring you in.
Yeah, mostly on how to live a more contemplative life in our crazy world, in our secular world. So all sorts of topics on that.
Very good. Before I thank Judith, finally, let me give my own little 2-cent commercial. So, and you know, my book, Thomas Merton Peacemaker, if you want to get my thoughts on Merton. The next Zoom is with my friend Carrie Kennedy, the daughter of Robert Kennedy and Ethel Kennedy, who I would consider one of the leading human rights activists in the planet. She's been to almost 100 countries, just going in right in the thick of things to give solidarity to the great human rights leaders in Africa and Latin America. She's going to talk about that with us. And I guess you all saw, I hope you saw my appeal letter from the Beatitudes Center. After 4 years of much discussion, the board and I are launching a weekly podcast series with 30-minute interviews and conversations, audio only. And it's going to start, it's every Monday for free. And first one will be posted on January 6th on the beatitudescenter.org website. As I was planning this, it got contacted by the National Catholic Reporter. They want to put it on the home page, which is amazing, and God. So it's going to have a big audience, and I hope you'll join me for the first one. And I'm going to just give a talk about living the Beatitudes in the year 2025 as a way to go forward. And then the next week, I have Martin Sheen. The following week, Bernard Lafayette, Dr. King's personal assistant, Helen Prejean, Joan Chittister, Richard Rohr, I kid you not, Martin Luther King III. No one said no. Everybody wants to do it. So help me and join me. You can check out the details at beatitudescenter.org. It has been a great blessing to have you all here. Judith, it was terrific. I thank you so much for your generosity and wisdom and inspiration and to taking us to a deeper place. And so, again, friends, please join me in giving a round of applause to our guest, Judith Valente. And we'll see you all next time. I'll say goodbye, Judith, to you and everyone. But anyone who wants to stay on after I turn off the recording is very welcome. I'll stay on a few minutes. I'm not expecting Judith to. See you next time. Judith, I'll write you. Okay, God bless everybody. A blessed Advent, a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and we'll stay strong and keep following Jesus into the new year. Okay, God bless everybody.